Some moments don't just change your life. They reveal who you've always been beneath the surface. My name is Evangeline Reed, and this is the story of how my husband's worst moment became my finest hour. The morning of our vow renewal ceremony dawned with deceptive beauty. Golden sunlight streamed through the gauze curtains of our bedroom, painting everything in warm, honeyed tones that should have felt like a blessing. Instead, as I lay there watching dust motes dance in the light, something cold and heavy settled in my chest, a premonition I couldn't quite name. "Today's the day," I whispered to myself, trying to inject enthusiasm into words that felt hollow. 15 years of marriage, and we were supposedly celebrating our enduring love in front of 97 guests. The irony wasn't lost on me that I knew the exact number because I'd been the one to organize everything, down to the last detail. David was already gone from bed, probably hitting the golf course for a quick 9 holes before the most important day of our married life. Again. Even on today, golf took priority. But I pushed that thought away, choosing instead to focus on the hope that this ceremony might somehow reset us, bring back whatever we'd lost along the way. Our marriage had been slowly suffocating under the weight of routine and unspoken resentments. David's increasingly frequent business trips that conveniently aligned with his golf tournaments. My growing realization that I'd somehow become invisible in my own life, a supporting character in a story where I should have been the protagonist. But today was supposed to change all that. Today was supposed to be our fresh start. I slipped out of bed and padded to the window, looking out at our backyard where workers were already setting up white chairs on the perfectly manicured lawn. The arch where we'd renew our vows stood like a promise against the backdrop of my carefully tended garden. The garden David always said was too much work for too little payoff. Everything looked exactly as I'd envisioned during the months of planning I'd done largely alone. "Mrs. Reed," came a voice from downstairs. "The florists are here." I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and began what I thought would be the most romantic day of my life. How wrong I was. The hours leading up to the ceremony passed in a whirlwind of activity that kept my growing anxiety at bay. My sister Natalie arrived early, her arms full of emergency supplies and her eyes bright with excitement. "Evie, you look absolutely radiant," she said, though I caught her studying my face with the concerned intensity only a sister could manage. "Are you nervous?" "Terrified," I admitted, applying a final coat of lipstick with hands that trembled just slightly. "But good terrified, you know, like when you're about to do something that might change everything." She nodded, but I saw something flicker across her expression, doubt, maybe, or pity. It was gone so quickly I might have imagined it, but it left me feeling exposed, like she could see cracks I'd been trying to hide. The house filled with the controlled chaos of preparation. My mother bustled around, directing the caterers with military precision. David's parents arrived from Connecticut, his mother immediately launching into subtle criticisms disguised as helpful suggestions. "Oh, you chose silk flowers for the arch? How practical." The word practical dripped with disdain. I smiled and nodded, playing the gracious hostess while inside, a small voice whispered that maybe this was a mistake. Maybe we were just putting expensive lipstick on a dying relationship, performing happiness for an audience instead of actually living it. David finally returned from golf at 2 o'clock, 30 minutes later than promised, naturally, with that particular brand of defensive cheerfulness he wore when he knew he'd pushed things too far. Sorry, lost track of time, you know how it is." He kissed my cheek perfunctorily, already distracted by his phone. "The guys wanted to grab lunch after, and you know how Peterson gets when." "It's fine," I cut him off, though we both knew it wasn't. "Just please be ready on time." "Of course, when am I ever not ready?" He said this with such genuine bewilderment that I almost laughed. David had perfected the art of being perpetually, charmingly late, as if punctuality were somehow beneath him. I watched him disappear upstairs to shower and change, and tried to ignore the growing knot in my stomach. This was our day. Our chance to remember why we'd fallen in love in the first place. I wasn't going to let his golf game or my own nerves ruin it. The guests began arriving at 4:30, transforming our backyard into a sea of familiar faces and forced smiles. Everyone seemed determined to project an image of perfect happiness, as if admitting that any marriage required work would somehow jinx their own relationships. "Evie, darling, you look stunning," gushed my former college roommate Margaret, air-kissing my cheeks with theatrical enthusiasm. 15 years and you haven't aged a day." I thanked her and moved through the crowd, accepting compliments and good wishes while part of me floated above it all, observing this strange performance we were all participating in. Everyone knew David and I had been struggling. Small communities like ours don't keep secrets well, but here we all were, pretending this ceremony was the natural result of marital bliss rather than a desperate attempt to resuscitate something that might already be dead. My nephew Tommy, all of 7 years old and blissfully unaware of adult complexities, tugged on my dress. "Aunt Evie, why are you getting married again? Didn't you already do it once?" "Sometimes, sweetheart," I said, kneeling down to his level. "People need to remember their promises to each other." He considered this with the serious expression children reserve for life's mysteries. "Like when I promise Mommy I'll clean my room, but then I forget." "Something like that," I agreed, though his innocent comparison cut deeper than he could know. At precisely 5 o'clock, the string quartet I'd hired, over David's protests about the expense, began playing Pachelbel's canon. The guests took their seats, a collective rustling of silk and settling of expectations. I stood at the back of our makeshift aisle, arm in arm with my father, trying to steady my breathing. "You sure about this, sweetheart?" Dad asked quietly. He'd never been one for many words, but his timing had always been impeccable. "Why wouldn't I be?" I asked, though the question felt like I was trying to convince myself more than answer him. He studied my face for a long moment. "You just look like you're walking to your execution rather than your renewal." Before I could respond, the music swelled, and we began our walk down the aisle. David stood at the altar in his navy suit, the one I'd picked out, naturally, looking handsome and composed and completely at ease. For a moment, seeing him there waiting for me, I felt a flutter of the old magic. This was the man I'd fallen in love with in college, the one who used to write me poetry and surprise me with midnight picnics. But as we drew closer, I noticed his jaw was tight, his smile slightly forced. When I reached him and took his hands, they were cold despite the warm afternoon air. "You look beautiful," he whispered, but his eyes were already darting to the crowd, playing to his audience. Pastor Williams, who'd officiated our original wedding, stepped forward with his warm, practiced smile. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness David and Evangeline as they renew the sacred vows they made 15 years ago. Marriage is not just a commitment made in a single moment, but a choice renewed each day, through joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge." I found myself hanging on his words, desperate for them to feel true. This was what I wanted, a daily choice, a conscious recommitment. Not the sleepwalking we'd been doing, parallel lives that occasionally intersected but never truly merged. "David and Evangeline have each prepared personal vows to share with us today," Pastor Williams continued. "David, would you like to begin?" David cleared his throat and pulled out a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. I hadn't known he'd written anything. We'd barely discussed the ceremony beyond logistics, and I felt a sudden surge of hope. Maybe he'd surprise me. Maybe this really would be our turning point. "Evangeline," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. 15 years ago, I promised to love, honor, and cherish you, and I have." He paused, and I waited for the poetry, the personal touches, the words that would remind me why I'd fallen in love with him. Instead, he seemed to be reading from a generic template he'd probably found online. "You've been a wonderful wife and mother. You've supported my career and maintained our home beautifully. You've been patient with my shortcomings." A small chuckle from the crowd at this. Everyone knew about David's golf obsession. "And I look forward to many more years of our partnership." Partnership, not love, not passion, not even friendship. Partnership, like we were business associates rather than soulmates. He folded the paper and looked at me expectantly, that same practiced smile he wore at work functions. The crowd applauded politely, and I realized with growing horror that he thought this was sufficient. That reducing 15 years of marriage, all our struggles and joys and private moments, to a few generic platitudes was enough. But I smiled and nodded, because that's what good wives do. That's what I'd been doing for years. And now, Evangeline, Pastor Williams prompted. I'd spent weeks crafting my vows, pouring my heart onto paper in a desperate attempt to articulate everything I felt, but could never seem to say out loud. I'd written about the early days of our marriage, when we'd been so broke, we'd shared a single bowl of ramen, but felt like the richest people in the world. About the night he'd held me through food poisoning without complaint. About how proud I'd been watching him build his business from nothing. But I'd also written about the loneliness, the feeling of being married to a stranger. About how I'd started having entire conversations with him in my head because actual communication had become so rare. About my growing fear that we were just going through the motions, that somewhere along the way we'd stopped being partners and become merely cohabitants. I'd agonized over every word, trying to find the balance between honesty and hope. These vows were my last-ditch effort to save us, to break through the wall of politeness and routine that had calcified around our marriage. I reached into my small clutch for the carefully folded pages, my hands trembling slightly as I unfolded them. The words I'd labored over looked back at me, and I took a deep breath, preparing to lay my soul bare in front of 97 people who would hopefully witness our resurrection rather than our funeral. David, I began, my voice carrying clearly in the still afternoon air. 15 years ago, I thought I knew what forever meant. I thought it was a promise you make once and then coast on for the rest of your life. I saw him shift slightly, perhaps sensing that this wasn't going to be the sanitized, generic response to his own lackluster vows. But I've learned that forever is actually made up of tiny moments. It's made up of choices, not just the big ones, but the small ones we make every single day. The crowd was quiet, attentive. I felt the weight of their expectations, their hopes for romance and renewal. I've learned that love isn't just a feeling, it's an action. It's showing up even when you don't feel like it. It's listening even when you think you know what the other person is going to say. It's choosing to stay curious about someone even after you think you know everything about them. David's smile was becoming strained, and I saw him glance at his watch. The gesture was small, almost unconscious, but it felt like a slap. Here I was trying to pour out my heart, and he was checking the time. I've learned that in marriage, you can't just be present in body, you have to be present in spirit. You have to show up not just for the big moments, but for the small ones. For the Tuesday evening conversations and the quiet Sunday mornings and the... "Is this going somewhere?" David interrupted, his voice pitched low but clearly audible to the front rows. "Because you're kind of going on a bit here." A ripple of shocked murmurs went through the crowd. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment, but I pressed on. What I'm trying to say is that I want us to choose each other actively, not just assume we'll always be there. I want us to. Evangeline, seriously. His voice was louder now, more forceful. People are hot. The reception starts in 20 minutes, and you're giving them a lecture instead of wedding vows. Can we wrap this up? The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, could feel the weight of 97 pairs of eyes watching this humiliation unfold. My mother's face was frozen in horror. My sister looked like she wanted to murder David with her bare hands. Even Pastor Williams seemed at a loss for words. For 15 years, I'd been swallowing moments like this. 15 years of being dismissed, interrupted, treated like my thoughts and feelings were inconvenient obstacles to David's schedule. 15 years of making myself smaller so he could feel bigger. But something happened in that moment of silence. Something clicked into place, like a key turning in a lock I didn't even know existed. "You know what, David?" I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "You're absolutely right. Let me wrap this up." I could see confusion flicker across his face. This wasn't how our script usually played out. Usually, I would apologize, acquiesce, smooth things over with a nervous laugh and a self-deprecating comment. Not today. I was going to talk about the time you drove 4 hours to surprise me when I was sick at my sister's house. I continued, my voice growing stronger. Or how you used to leave little notes in my lunch bag. Or how you cried when we miscarried 3 years ago, and I realized it was the first time I'd seen you vulnerable since our wedding day. David's face was reddening. Evangeline, what are you doing? This isn't. But instead, I said, speaking right over him for the first time in our marriage, let me talk about last Tuesday. Do you remember last Tuesday, David? He opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't give him the chance. Last Tuesday, I made your favorite dinner, that salmon dish that takes 2 hours to prepare properly. I set the table. That's when he exploded. Enough. The word cracked across the yard like a whip. Several guests actually jumped in their seats. A baby started crying somewhere in the back rows. I am sick of this, David shouted, his composure completely shattered. I'm sick of you analyzing every little thing I do. I'm sick of you making mountains out of molehills. I'm sick of you acting like I'm the worst husband in the world when I work my ass off to provide for this family. The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the birds seemed to be singing. You want to know the truth, he continued, his voice still raised but slightly more controlled. You want to know why I don't hang on your every word? Because half the time you're complaining about something. The house, the schedule, my golf, my work, the way I load the dishwasher, nothing is ever good enough for you. I felt something inside me crumble and rebuild simultaneously, like a building being demolished to make way for something stronger. And now, he went on, now you want to air our dirty laundry in front of everyone we know. You want to humiliate me at our own vow renewal. What kind of wife does that? He was breathing hard, his chest rising and falling rapidly. The crowd seemed frozen, afraid to move or make a sound that might draw his attention. You know what? I'm done. I'm done with this performance. I'm done with this whole charade. He started pulling off his boutonniere with shaking fingers. We both know this marriage has been over for years. We both know we're just going through the motions. At least I'm honest about it instead of pretending that some fancy ceremony is going to magically fix everything that's wrong between us. He threw the boutonniere on the ground at my feet. Enjoy your party, Evangeline. Since you planned every detail without asking what I wanted anyway, I'm sure it'll be exactly what you think it should be. And with that, my husband of 15 years turned on his heel and walked away from our vow renewal ceremony, leaving me standing at the altar in front of 97 people who looked like they'd just witnessed a car accident. The silence stretched on and on. I could hear my own breathing, the rustle of fabric as people shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, the distant sound of traffic from the street beyond our house. This was it. This was my moment of ultimate humiliation. The story people would tell for years, about the woman whose husband walked out on their vow renewal, who got left at the altar in her own backyard. I looked out at the sea of faces, shocked, pitying, uncomfortable. My mother had tears in her eyes. My sister looked ready to commit murder. David's parents sat rigid with embarrassment. This should have been where I broke down, where I ran after him, apologizing, begging him to come back, promising to be different, to be smaller, to take up less space in his life. But I didn't. Instead, I bent down and picked up David's boutonniere. I held it for a moment, this small symbol of promises broken and hopes dashed. Then I looked up at Pastor Williams, who was watching me with a mixture of concern and admiration. Pastor Williams, I said, my voice carrying clearly in the silence, if you don't mind, I'd like to finish my vows. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Pastor Williams looked uncertain, glancing toward the house where David had disappeared, then back at me. Evangeline, he said gently, perhaps we should. Please, I interrupted, and there was something in my voice that made him stop. I need to finish what I started. I turned to face the assembled guests, these people who had come to witness a renewal and instead had gotten a demolition. They stared back at me with a mixture of pity, shock, and something else, curiosity maybe, or hope. I know this isn't what any of us expected, I began, my voice steady despite the chaos of emotions swirling inside me. Trust me, it's not what I expected either. a few nervous chuckles from the crowd. I saw my nephew Tommy looking around in confusion, trying to understand why the grown-ups all looked so upset. But you know what? Maybe this is exactly what needed to happen. I took a deep breath, feeling strangely lighter despite everything that had just transpired. I spent weeks writing vows about renewal, about choosing each other again, about the promise of forever. But David was right about one thing. We both know this marriage has been over for years. More murmurs, but I pressed on. What David doesn't understand is that sometimes things have to end before they can truly begin. Sometimes you have to let go of who you've been in order to become who you're meant to be. I looked down at my wedding ring, the simple gold band I'd worn for 15 years. With deliberate care, I slipped it off my finger and held it up so everyone could see. 15 years ago, I made a promise to love, honor, and cherish David Reed. And I kept that promise, even when he stopped keeping his. I loved him through his indifference. I honored him even when he dishonored me. I cherished him even when he treated me like an inconvenience. The ring caught the late afternoon sunlight, throwing tiny rainbows across my palm. But today, I want to make a different kind of promise. Not to a man who walks away when things get difficult, but to someone who deserves so much better than that. I paused, feeling the weight of the moment, the significance of what I was about to do. Today, I want to make a promise to myself. I saw my sister's eyes widen with understanding and fierce pride. My mother sat straighter in her chair. Even some of David's family members were nodding. "Evangeline Reed," I said, speaking directly to my own reflection in the ring's polished surface. "I promise to love you enough to never settle for someone who doesn't see your worth." My voice was growing stronger with each word, as if I'd been holding my breath for 15 years and was finally learning to breathe again. "I promise to honor your voice, especially when others try to silence it. I promise to cherish your dreams, your thoughts, your feelings, even when the people who should value them most dismiss them as inconvenient." Someone in the crowd, I think it was Margaret, wiped away a tear. "I promise to never again make yourself smaller so someone else can feel bigger. I promise to take up exactly as much space as you deserve, which is all of it." I looked up from the ring to the faces watching me, and I saw something I hadn't expected: respect. These people weren't looking at me with pity anymore. They were looking at me with admiration. "I promise to remember that you don't need someone else's validation to be worthy of love. You don't need someone else's attention to be interesting. You don't need someone else's approval to take up space in this world." Pastor Williams had tears in his eyes. Even some of the men in the crowd looked moved. "I promise to surround you with people who celebrate you, not tolerate you. People who see your words as gifts, not burdens. People who show up, really show up, for the small moments and the big ones alike." I paused, feeling the full weight of what I was doing, what I was choosing. "And most importantly, Evangeline Reed, I promise to never, ever settle for less than you deserve again. Because what you deserve is someone who would rather die than interrupt your wedding vows. What you deserve is someone who remembers anniversaries without being reminded. What you deserve is someone who sees loving you not as a burden, but as the greatest privilege of their life." The silence that followed wasn't the uncomfortable, shocked silence from before. This was reverent silence, the kind that comes after witnessing something sacred. I held up the ring one more time, letting it catch the light. This ring represented a promise that was broken long before today. But promises don't have to be permanent when they're built on foundations that were never solid to begin with. With that, I slipped the ring into my bouquet and set the whole thing down at the base of the altar. "I don't need to renew old vows," I said, my voice carrying to the very back rows. "I need to make new ones." The applause started slowly, just my sister at first, clapping with tears streaming down her face. Then my mother joined in, then Margaret, then others throughout the crowd. Within moments, 97 people were on their feet, applauding not for a marriage renewed, but for a woman reborn. But I wasn't done yet. "I know this is supposed to be where I walk away, where I retreat in embarrassment and spend the next few months hiding from all of you out of shame," I continued, raising my voice slightly over the applause. "But you know what? I planned this party for months. I chose the menu, I hired the band, I selected every single flower in this garden." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Real laughter, not the polite tittering from earlier. And David was right about one thing. I planned every detail without asking what he wanted. Because after 15 years of marriage, I finally realized that he didn't actually want to be involved in building something beautiful together. He wanted to show up and enjoy the results of someone else's work. More applause, more nods of recognition. I saw several of the married women in the crowd exchanging meaningful looks with their husbands. "So here's what we're going to do. We're going to celebrate anyway. We're going to eat the dinner I planned, we're going to dance to the music I chose, and we're going to toast to new beginnings instead of false renewals." The energy in the crowd was shifting, becoming electric. What had started as a disaster was transforming into something unprecedented, a celebration of self-respect, of choosing dignity over desperation. Consider this a different kind of vow renewal ceremony. Today, I'm renewing my vows to myself. I'm promising to be. "Can we still have cake?" I laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd had in months. "We can definitely still have cake." The party that followed was unlike anything I could have imagined. Without David's presence casting a pall over everything, without the pressure to perform marital happiness, the celebration took on a life of its own. The band, initially uncertain about whether to continue playing, was encouraged by the guests to proceed with the full program. The caterers, after a brief consultation with me, served the dinner exactly as planned. But the tone was entirely different. Instead of polite small talk and forced gaiety, conversations became real and deep. People shared stories, offered support, made genuine connections. It felt less like a wedding reception and more like a community gathering, people coming together to witness and celebrate transformation. My sister, Natalie, pulled me aside during the dinner. "Evie, I have to ask, how long have you been planning this?" I looked at her in surprise. "Planning what? You think I planned for David to have a meltdown and storm off?" "No, not that. But the way you handled it, the things you said, that wasn't spur of the moment. That was you finally saying things you've been thinking for a long time." She was right, of course. The specific words might have been spontaneous, but the thoughts behind them had been building for years. "I guess I've been rehearsing that speech in my head for longer than I realized," I admitted. "I just never thought I'd get the chance to give it." "Well, I'm glad you did. Do you know how many times over the years I've wanted to shake you and tell you to stop settling for so little? But I knew you had to realize it yourself." We stood there watching the guests, my guests now, not ours, enjoying themselves in a way that felt authentic and joyful. "What happens now?" Natalie asked. "Now I figure out what Evangeline Reed looks like, when she's not trying to be the perfect wife to someone who doesn't appreciate her." The immediate aftermath of what became known in our social circle as the vow renewal heard round the world was surprisingly peaceful. David spent that night at his brother's house and didn't return for 3 days. When he finally came home, it was only to pack a suitcase and mumble something about needing time to think. I didn't try to stop him. I didn't apologize or try to smooth things over or suggest couples counseling. For the first time in our marriage, I simply said, "Okay." The house felt different with him gone, not empty, but spacious. I found myself wandering from room to room, noticing things I'd stopped seeing years ago. The way the morning light hit the kitchen table where I'd eaten countless rushed breakfasts. The books on my nightstand that I'd never had time to read because I was always too busy managing everyone else's schedules. The garden visible through the living room window. My garden, that I'd created and maintained despite David's dismissive comments. On the second day, I did something I hadn't done in years. I sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee and watched the sunrise without thinking about anyone's schedule but my own. The phone calls started almost immediately. Some were supportive, friends and family who'd witnessed my transformation and wanted to check on me. Others were less comfortable with what I'd done, framing their concern in terms of marriage is work, and everyone has bad days, and maybe you were too harsh. I listened to these calls with interest rather than defensiveness. It was fascinating to discover who in my life was committed to my happiness and who was more invested in my compliance. My mother surprised me by falling firmly into the first camp. "Evangeline," she said during her call on day 3, "I need to tell you something. Your father and I have been married for 42 years and never once, not once, has he interrupted me during something important to me. Good marriages don't require you to make yourself invisible." Her words hit me like a revelation. I'd spent so long normalizing David's behavior that I'd forgotten what respect actually looked like. "I was proud of you at that ceremony," she continued. "Terrified for you, but proud. You reminded me of the girl who used to write stories and dream of becoming a journalist. I'd wondered what happened to her." "She got married and forgot she existed," I said quietly. "Well, she's back now. The question is, what is she going to do next?" That question haunted me in the best possible way. For the first time in 15 years, I had the luxury of thinking about what I wanted rather than what was expected of me. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. I started small. I signed up for a creative writing class at the community college, something I'd mentioned wanting to do years ago, only to be told by David that it was impractical, and we didn't have room in the budget for hobbies. I bought books without justifying the expense to anyone. I rearranged the living room furniture to face the garden instead of the television. Each small act of self-determination felt like a tiny revolution. The writing class was where I met Helena, a 70-year-old retired teacher who'd started writing poetry after her husband died. "You know what I love most about being widowed?" she told me during our second week, apropos of nothing. "I can eat dinner whenever I want. I can watch whatever I want on TV. I can go to bed at 9 or stay up until midnight reading, and nobody sighs dramatically about it." I must have looked shocked because she laughed. "Oh, don't look at me like that. I loved my Harold dearly, but love doesn't mean you have to disappear into someone else's preferences. It took me 68 years to figure that out. You're lucky. You figured it out at what, 38? 37, I corrected. Even better, you've got time to build a whole new life. The idea was both thrilling and daunting. A whole new life. Not just recovering from David's abandonment, but actively choosing something different, something better. David called on the 10th day. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Evangeline," he said without preamble, "we need to talk." "Okay," I said simply. "Can I come over?" I looked around the house, my house now, arranged according to my preferences, quiet in the way I preferred it. "I think it's better if we meet somewhere neutral." We agreed on a coffee shop downtown, the same chain where we'd had our first date 15 years ago. I wondered if he'd chosen it deliberately, hopping the nostalgia would work in his favor. When I arrived, he was already there, looking uncharacteristically disheveled. David had always been meticulous about his appearance, but today his shirt was wrinkled and his hair looked like he'd been running his hands through it. "You look good," he said as I sat down across from him. I did look good. I'd lost weight in the past week and a half, not from stress, but from finally paying attention to what my body actually wanted instead of mindlessly eating while managing everyone else's needs. I was sleeping better, too, which showed in clearer skin and brighter eyes. "Thank you," I said. We sat in silence for a moment. This was usually where I would rush to fill the quiet, to smooth over any awkwardness. Instead, I waited. "Evangeline," he finally began, "what happened at the ceremony?" That wasn't me. I was stressed about work, and the whole day felt like so much pressure, and I just snapped. I nodded but didn't speak. "I've been thinking about what you said, about not listening, about taking you for granted. And maybe there's some truth to that. Maybe, after 15 years of marriage and a public humiliation, he was willing to concede that maybe he'd been less than perfect. I think we should try counseling," he continued. "I think we can work through this if we both commit to doing the work." I studied his face, looking for something, genuine remorse, perhaps, or evidence that he truly understood what had happened between us. Instead, I saw the same expression he wore when negotiating business deals. Earnest but calculating, focused on achieving a desired outcome rather than grappling with underlying truth. "David," I said carefully, "do you know why I wanted to renew our vows?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Because it was our 15-year anniversary." "No, I wanted to renew our vows because I was hoping it would remind us both of why we fell in love in the first place. I was hoping it would be a fresh start for us." He nodded eagerly. "Exactly, that's what I'm talking about, a fresh start." I shook my head slowly. "David, you interrupted my vows because you were worried about the reception timeline. You yelled at me in front of our friends and family. You threw your boutonniere at my feet and walked away. That's not someone who wants a fresh start. That's someone who wants to control the narrative." His jaw tightened. "So what, one bad moment defines our entire marriage?" It wasn't one bad moment. It was the moment that finally made me see clearly what our marriage had become. We sat in silence again, but this time it felt different, final somehow. "So that's it?" he asked. 15 years, and you're just going to throw it all away over a wedding ceremony." "I'm not throwing anything away, David. I'm choosing to stop settling for scraps when I deserve a feast." 6 months later, I was sitting in my lawyer's office, signing the last of the divorce papers. David had fought it initially, alternating between anger and attempts at reconciliation, but eventually accepted that I wasn't coming back. The settlement was fair, more than fair, actually. David's guilt had made him generous. As I walked out of the lawyer's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete peace with my own choices. I pulled out my phone to text my sister the news and found a me.